Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you very much for joining us here at the WHO Regional Office for Europe in Copenhagen. For those of you, plus the journalists joining us around the world, a very warm welcome. Today, we are very proud to launch the final report of the recommendations of the Pan-European Commission on Health and Sustainable Development, drawing light from the pandemic, a new strategy for health and sustainable development. The report makes a series of very bold recommendations that will help prepare our region for future pandemics and much, much more. Before I introduce our panelists, I'm going to play a short video. Thank you.
The pandemic that swept the world in 2020 and beyond led to catastrophic health, social and economic impacts. In response, WHO Europe convened a commission of political, economic and scientific leaders to find solutions to these challenges. Now the Commission has produced a report with 7 objectives and related recommendations to guide governments in responding better to health threats. One Health recognises the interconnection and related risks between people, plants, animals and their shared environment. The Commission recommends that countries establish cross-government One Health strategies and that international agencies collaborate more closely. For years, policies have contributed to high levels of wealth and income inequality, leading to declining levels of trust and the polarisation of society. The Commission recommends identifying those who live in difficult circumstances, developing policies to give them security, and increasing women's representation in public bodies. The existing model of innovation in health is flawed. The Commission recommends that governments harness innovation to improve One Health, based on partnership between the public and private sectors, where both risks and returns are shared. Many countries have underinvested in health systems. The Commission recommends boosting under-resourced areas, including primary and mental health care, working to attract, retain and support health workers, strengthening the links between health and social care, and prioritising disease prevention. Accounting systems can inform decision-making. The Commission recommends that health expenditure data distinguishes between spending and investment. WHO's surveillance powers for health systems are strengthened, incorporating periodic preparedness assessments. Investment in early warning systems and crisis response is scaled up. More development financing is spent on health, and health is factored into economic forecasts. Most countries have agreed on joint action to address health threats, but further funds for global health are needed. The Commission recommends creating a global health board under the G20, a pandemic treaty for joint decision-making, and a global pandemic vaccine policy. The European region is both highly diverse, but also very interconnected. The Commission recommends the establishment of a Pan-European Health Threats Council to maintain political commitment and cooperation, and a network for disease control to respond to emerging threats. The Pan-European Commission calls on governments to work together for change. By doing so, we can ensure that the Pan-European region and the world become truly resilient, more equitable, and enable people to thrive.
Thank you very much for your attention. And I'm going to now introduce some of our very eminent guests who it's an absolute honour to have with us today. Professor Mario Monti, Chair of the Pan-European Commission and also former Italian Prime Minister and a former European Commissioner, joins us this morning from Bocconi. We have from Helsinki, we are joined by President Tarja Halonen, one of the commissioners who contributed to this report, and former President of Finland. And from London, Professor Martin McKee, the Chair of the Commission's Scientific Advisory Board and Professor of European Public Health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. A very warm welcome to all three of you and thank you for joining us today. Before I hand over to the Regional Director, Dr. Hans Kluger, sat here to my left, to make his opening statement. Let me remind you of our other panel members that are with us today. We have back now Miss Dr. Catherine Smallwood, COVID-19 Incident Manager in the European WHO Emergencies Programme. And we have Dr. Siddhartha Datta, the WHO Regional Advisor for Vaccine Preventable Diseases and Immunisation. So without any further delay, I will pass the floor to the Regional Director. Hans, you have the floor.
Thank you, Rob. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. 12 months ago, WHO Europe tasked 18 European political, academic and scientific heavyweights and international leaders with rethinking health and policy in the light of pandemics. Today marks the culmination of their work and the beginning of our work. The recommendations of the Pan-European Commission on Health and Sustainable Development, made public today, shaped by the vision of Professor Mario Monti, are nothing short of groundbreaking. This is an ambitious but realistic agenda for a healthier, safer future. These are actionable recommendations that give governments and decision makers tools to prevent and better handle future health threats. Recommendations that save lives and livelihoods, trigger innovation, empower people, protect the planet. Identifying strategies for success is not the hard part. We know where we as society fell short and what needs to be done. What is hard is to break the cycle of frenzied action followed by neglectful underinvestment, to act and prepare for tomorrow's threats, adapt to new ways of thinking and think long-term, to make the tough decisions to invest in our futures now without seeing immediate rewards. We have already paid a colossal price, but there is even higher price to be paid if we turn a blind eye and do not learn from our mistakes. In a few days' time, the region's health ministers will be gathering for the 71st Regional Committee session. Today's report, a roadmap on navigating the future, will dominate the agenda. This report, this blueprint, is an opportunity of learning from history, an opportunity to not repeat it. To the 53 governments in the WHO European region, I say, grasp it and run with it. It is now up to the member states and international organizations, civil society, to show the political courage to keep health at the top of the international agenda, to take up the Commission's cross-cutting recommendations and implement them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Regional Director. And I might pass the floor immediately now to Professor Mario Monti, who's joining us from Bocconi University, Milan. Professor Monti, may I pass you the floor, please, sir?
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished members of the press, Regional Director Dr. Kluge, dear Hans, Professor McKee, Professor Mosialos, fellow commissioners, in particular President Alonen, it is a pleasure to be joining you today to present the findings and recommendations of the Pan-European Commission on Health and Sustainable Development. As this decade dawned, the world faced a monumental and unsolicited stress test, the COVID-19 pandemic. And as events have unfolded in the months since, we can be in no doubt that our political, economic, and social systems have catastrophically failed to manage the defining crisis of our time. There has been a tragic loss of lives, a disastrous impact on livelihoods. We cannot accept the consequences of our failings during this pandemic. without trying to identify and tackle their causes. From this darkness, we must attempt to draw light. This is the reason that the Pan-European Commission on Health and Sustainable Development was convened by Dr. Kluge, and the reason why we present our recommendations to you today. Leading experts from the field of politics, life science, economy, health and social care, business and finance have reached a consensus on the need for two novel approaches to move forward. Firstly, we must fully recognize the interconnections between the health of humans, animals, plants, and the planet. That means environment, biodiversity, and climate above all. And secondly, the resulting One Health policy that we propose must in turn be intimately integrated in a wider and coherent policy framework comprising economic and financial, technological, social, and international policies. Today, my fellow commissioners and I share the culmination of a year of review and research, discussions, and deliberations. We believe that the 7 objectives and related recommendations we have set down in our report provide clarity, a light by which we can reset the path to equitable, sustainable development. We propose that countries establish One Health strategies so that the linkages and risks related to the interface of human, animal, and environmental health can be addressed concretely in a coordinated way. We call on countries to tackle deep-rooted inequalities, identify those who live in difficult circumstances, and develop policies to give them more security. We ask for the risks and returns around innovation and development to be shared between the private and the public sectors. We seek greater investment in health systems, particularly primary and mental health care, as well as in the health workforce. We underline that health surveillance, early warning systems, and crisis response must be strengthened. We suggest improving global governance for health through the creation of a global health and finance board under the G20, a pandemic treaty for joint decision-making, and a global pandemic vaccine policy. We advocate for the establishment of a Pan-European Health Threats Council and a network for disease control to maintain political commitment and take decisive action when threats arise. These are some of the recommendations you will find in the report. Now, it remains for me to thank each and every commissioner for their huge commitment, collaboration, and expertise, to recognize the invaluable guidance and support of Professor Martin McKee and Professor Elias Mosialos, bringing scientific rigor to this process and coordinating the scientific review, which is also published today, and to acknowledge that this commission and its report would not have been possible without the inspiration and enterprise of WHO Regional Director for Europe, Dr. Kluge. The world walked into the COVID-19 crisis lacking foresight, unwilling and unable to reach consensus on current pressing challenges. countries were stuck, looking on their doorsteps, seeking to solve transnational problems with outdated national solutions. Future generations will not thank us for our short-sightedness. We need a new vision. We present to you a bold new strategy for health and sustainable development in the light of pandemics. And now, finally, I have the great privilege of asking President Tarja Halonen, former president of the Finnish Republic, a very active and inspiring member of our commission, to kindly take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. I join all the thanks by Professor Monti also. So in my remarks, I will concentrate on the part of the report that digs into underlying societal problems and demonstrates how existing inequalities have worsened the effects of this pandemic and threatened the resilience of our societies. While everyone, of course, has experienced some effects of this pandemic, some people were harder hit than others. Crises such as this pandemic are like magnifying glass that shows and amplify the existing problems in the society. New leadership and decision-making must be based on a genuine understanding that what is important to an individual is important also to society, environment, and economy as well. Our work recognizes the interlinkages of economy and well-being while putting One Health in the heart of the future responses. The report contributes to the national policies, planning, and monitoring. The cooperation at global level could enhance that and help accelerate the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Then, trust in the society. Wealth, health, and social inequalities and structural discrimination have made space for growing polarization of the society and led to mistrust of political institutions and even science. This, on the other hand, can hinder and has already hindered some effective response measures. So we call for the decision-making which involves both the whole of government but also all of society perspectives. We call for putting inclusiveness, social cohesion, as well as science and the practical life, the evidence at the heart of all policies. All stakeholders at all levels have a role to minimize inequality and mend the fractures which left so many vulnerable to the pandemic. In this context, prevention is also the idea behind sustainable development. Prevention saves lives, systems, and resources. The pandemic and its response measures have affected different way in different groups. And I take one big example. Women and men have been also affected differently. Men have suffered disproportionately the direct health effects of the COVID-19 disease. But women, on the other hand, have been harder hit by the secondary effects, those that can be harder to identify. For example, women have been much more likely to lose their jobs during the pandemic. Violence against women has increased during lockdown. Studies show that the unpaid care workers' responsibilities have increased very strongly for the women compared to men, and the list goes on. So we call for attention to these existing structural inequalities by collecting relevant data and identifying those people who are in disadvantaged situation. And finally, we call for special emphasis on gender equality beyond, so we accept. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President Halonen. Professor Monti, and also Regional Director, for those opening statements. I'm now going to turn to the media that are joining us today online. I will invite you to raise your hands in the Zoom system, please, if you'd like to pose a question to any of our panelists on any question. Please do raise a question via the Zoom hand-raising system. We have a few questions in advance. Now, as Professor Monti recognised, we're joined by Professor Martin McKee, the Chair of the Commission's Scientific Advisory Board, who sits on our panel today. Professor McKee, thank you again for joining us today. I'd like to pose the first question that we've received from Vince Chadwick from DevEx, over your way. And that regards the Commission's final recommendations. The question from Mr. Chadwick is, what is the most important recommendation? So,
well, thanks for the question.
Please, go ahead.
Thanks for the question. Of course, there are a whole series of practical steps that can be taken, and Professor Monti has already outlined them. But I think the most important one is one which underpins the entire. We need to think of the health of humans, of animals, of the natural environment as all part of the thing, recognizing also that all of them live in essentially a sea of microorganisms, all interacting with each other. This is what we call One Health. And you will see in our report, we have a diagram, a figure, a conceptual model of health with One Health right at the center of that, but then influenced by a whole series of other things that we have some control over, which can make things better or worse. So I think that's the most important recommendation, that we take the concept of One Health and embed it at all levels, from local through to national, through to international, and change the way we think about health.
Thank you, Professor McKee. I have two follow-up questions that are related to this as well, which I think I would pass to Professor Monti, if I could, that were sent to us in advance and forwarded to Professor Monti. The questions that follow were, which recommendation is the easiest to implement, and which recommendation is the hardest to implement? Professor Monti, if I could ask you to comment on that, respond. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's hard to say which of the two questions is the hardest to answer, but I would say that there are a number of relatively modest recommendations that can be adopted by individual countries quite rapidly. If we take, however, the boldest recommendations, it may well be that one of the most visionary of them might be decided rather early on. I refer here to our proposal that the G20 should establish a global health and finance board, which would be a very, very important innovation in the whole governance of health and related policies. So if it is so bold and visionary, why do I say that might be among the easiest to implement? Well, simply because the actual political debate on this has started well before today, well before our official proposal, because already in our call to action of last March, we set out this idea, and the G20 the presidency of the G20 has started and already advanced quite a bit in achieving consensus on this. And so actually it's hard to tell if and when it will come, but certainly the debate and the operational political action on this has started well before the publication of the report. About the hardest to implement, well, many of the decisions will require the political commitment to see them through. However, purely in terms of the complexity of the process, it seems likely that achieving an agreement on a new pandemic treaty may be the most difficult, mainly because of the number of different actors involved. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Monti. So I'm going to try and alternate between live and the questions that were sent in advance. So I'll go over to those journalists that are joining us online, and first to Carlo Martuccelli from Politico Europe. Carlo, good morning.
Good morning, and thank you so much for taking my question today. I just had one regarding the suggestion of joint decision-making in global pandemic vaccine policy. I wanted to know, is this a new suggestion? And also, what would it look like, especially in light of what we've seen as the shortcomings with COVAX? How do we ensure that joint decision-making is in fact joint and not just monopolized by producer countries? And I had a second question as well regarding the proposed European Disease Monitoring Network. In the EU, we obviously have the ECDC, but that's only a few countries in the European region. So what does a disease monitoring network look like, and would it be a standalone agency? Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Carlo. I'm going to pass those questions first to Professor McKee, and then ask or invite Professor Monti if he'd like to add anything. Professor McKee, please.
Okay, do you want me to take both of them?
Yes, please, if you could.
The first one was basically about vaccine equity. And I think I would refer you here to the evidence review, because this is a complicated issue. We need to get more vaccines across the world. However, there are trade-offs to be made in all of this, and there are very complex issues. So we do argue for a new strategy which would make vaccines much more easily available. But we don't go into a great deal of detail into how this would be done. But we do set out the options in the report and in the evidence review. So maybe I could refer you to that. In terms of the pan-European approach to disease surveillance, there's no point in duplicating what we already have. There already is quite a lot of infrastructure in some parts of the region, particularly the work done by ECDC, which, although it's limited primarily to the European Union, it does have a global reach in the same way that all organizations involved in communicable disease surveillance have to look at what's happening elsewhere. So again, I think what we would be expecting would be that there would be a network arrangement which would strengthen the collaboration in this area between those organizations, which is in effect the way ECDC already does work, because it has its core function, but it also works very closely with the systems in the member states.
Professor Monti, would you like to add any points to Professor McKee?
Just a contextual observation. We can see in this press briefing that the report has proposals addressed at domestic policies, others at the pan-European level, and others at the global level. Have we exceeded our mandate by venturing into also global governance? No, I believe not, because it would be self-defeating to pretend and address such an issue like pandemic merely with national or even continental measures. On the other hand, we have been faithful to the primary objective set out by Dr. Kluge, which was the pan-European dimension and jurisdiction. He's 53 member states. That's why we dwell also with proposals confined to the pan-European region. And it will be most interesting for us to present those proposals and the whole of the report on Monday to the regional European Committee of WHO.
Thank you very much, Professor Monti. And next, I would like to take a question from Nikolai Skuzgård, who's joining us from Reuters this morning. Nikolai?
Morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
We can. Please go ahead.
Good. I just have two questions. One is a follow-up to the priors. On the global pandemic vaccine policy, how exactly or concretely would that perhaps help prevent the vaccine schemes that we've seen during this pandemic, that mostly Western countries get their fill first, and then lesser developed countries need to sort of get the vaccines where they can. How is what concrete steps can be taken to ensure this greater vaccine equity? And then secondly, on Africa, as the WHO is supporting new vaccine hubs in Africa, how far is WHO willing to go in using third-party intellectual property and patents on vaccines and also manufacturing technology? Would you seek to sort of eventually negotiate licenses from patent holders, or how far is the WHO willing to go? Thanks.
Thanks, Nikolai. I'm going to pass this over to Dr. Siddhartha Datta, our program manager and unit lead for vaccine preventable diseases and immunization here at the WHO regional office. Siddhartha.
Thank you so much, Rob. Thank you, Nikolai, for that question. Just to set the ground that this is quite important that every country, irrespective of their income level, gets an access to this vaccine. And the population living in those countries get also access to the vaccine wherever they live. So that is the entirety of ensuring equity, which has been the call from WHO for a long time period. However, as you have heard from Regional Director, also in the previous press conferences, there are three important things that we need to ensure to make it happen in reality. There has to be a concerted and a coherent effort towards increasing production. Then also should be an increasing cohort around increased sharing of the doses so that everybody can get access to this vaccine and the vulnerable population in every country gets protected. The other important around waiver of the intellectual property rights, as you have seen from the World Trade Organization, including from WHO, there has been a call around this waiver. But just wanted to make sure here one thing, that increasing production is a complicated process. Transferring technology is also an important but complicated process. This needs expertise in a country, but also making sure that the manufacturing happening in a country is of good quality. So good clinical practices, good manufacturing practices are an equal and important element into this process. WHO's point has always been to institutionalize this capacity in a country so that this entire production can be widened, the base can be widened so that the population's access or the country's access to this life-saving yet an important tool that we have for COVID-19 pandemic becomes available for everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Siddhartha. I'm going to go to you, Gerardo D'Amico, in a moment, but if I could first to President Halonen, who's joining us on the panel today. And thank you again, President Halonen, for joining us. Today sees the launch of the Pan-European Commission on Health and Sustainable Development's final report. And we have a question here. In an ideal world, had all of your recommendations been in place pre-COVID-19, how would the pandemic have turned out differently? So, President Halonen, a tough question for you, but I'll put it over to you. Nonetheless, thank you.
Thank you. So obviously, we feel that the course of the pandemic would have been very different. Otherwise, we would not have made these recommendations. But of course, I'm a little bit cautious as historians about invoking counterfactuals. So we would like to think that pandemic would have been stopped in its tracks, as it was the case with the SARS in 2003. But even if that had not been the case totally, so our recommendations should have allowed many of the countries that suffered most to have experienced a much lower impact on the health of the population. And I would say that the same concerning the different groups in the society. So if I put it in very shortly, so our recommendations are those you should take very seriously.
Thank you, President Hallinan. May I now go to Gerardo D'Amico from Rai News 24 Italy, and also welcoming other media to raise their hands if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
We can. Please go ahead, Gerardo.
Thank you. My question is for the President Mario Monti. I would like to ask if there is an idea of the resource that needed to implement your proposal, and if they should be by single country or community, and given that in the vision on One Health, we are not limited only the health, but also the huge problems such as pollution. How can we convince all states, all countries to participate? Thank you.
Professor Monti, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. D'Amico, for this question. Indeed, there will be many resources needed to implement the set of recommendations. But the report shows also ways to look into this problem. Many of us are economists, so as you can imagine, we did not neglect the problem of resources altogether. But we try also to give an idea of how costly it has been in economic and financial terms not to be ready for a pandemic like this one. What we have seen is that not only all governments have had to put up huge resources to take care of individuals, households, companies, but also there has been everywhere in Europe, in the US, everywhere, a big distortion for almost 2 years already of the way in which all economic policies work. Monetary policy has been compelled to go out of its way to support the economic reactions to the pandemic, tax policy, huge deficits and debts in addition, suspension of rules in systems which have ordinarily rules about state aid, budgetary limits like in the European Union. So the economic directly and indirectly through lowered efficiency of economic policies, the economic cost of the pandemic has been so huge that we propose that for the future, there should be a more over time budgetary consideration in order to make it reasonable economically and understandable by the public opinion to allocate each year sums which will not be extra costs, but a spreading over time of the huge costs that would be there in case of a new tragedy like this one. And you rightly asked the question, resources coming from single countries or from the international community? Well, both. We believe that some measures and its funding belong to the domestic policies, others belong to the international community. But let me finally stress that what will be politically more costly is not even the financial burden, but the necessity shown extremely clearly by this pandemic for countries to act together and not to pretend to address transnational problems only with their national instruments. This is a pretension to keep a sovereignty alive when the sovereignty, in fact, in these topics no longer exists, unfortunately.
Thank you very much, Professor Monti, and thank you for your question, Gerardo. I'm next going to go over to Mos Appelblad at the Brussels Times. For you, Professor McKee, I think this one, the preparedness and response to the pandemic differed by country. I think we've touched upon this slightly already, but this implies that the lessons are also country-specific, although some lessons are probably also common. In some countries, evaluations and audits of the response and decision-making during the corona crisis have already been carried out. In other countries, they have been postponed because of the evolving crisis. To what extent does your report draw on findings and recommendations in such reports? And if so, how would you summarise them?
Yeah, we do draw very heavily on them to the extent that they are available. In fact, there are quite a few sources. So we have, in a number of countries, inquiries by parliaments or legislatures, even if the executive, even if the governments haven't done them. They've been quite important. There have been civil society organizations, people's inquiry into COVID in a number of countries that have been very helpful. There have also been a number of civil society organizations that have been monitoring what's being happening, and we've drawn on that. And also, interestingly, a number of accounts, autobiographies are beginning to emerge from people who were playing. Always have to be careful about reading history about oneself if one's writing it, but all of these have been taken into account, and you'll see that they're referenced in the evidence review, at least as far as we could up to the time that we went to press. Well, what are the major lessons? I think the key thing is that technical capacity, all the measures of preparedness that were picked up in the Global Health Security Index and so on are important, and you need to have them. But you need more than that. You need the political leader in place to be able to react, because even a few days of delay with a disease that is spreading exponentially can be incredibly important. Secondly, you need to have the infrastructure in place. You cannot start recruiting health workers in the middle of a crisis if you haven't invested in them up until now, and if you haven't invested in their training, and if you haven't put in place systems of flexibility so they can cross-cover for each other. And I think third, a key message that again has been picked up by Professor Monti and Dr. Kluge earlier is the importance of having resilient social systems, having social safety nets in place, and in particular systems that protect those growing numbers of people in many countries that are leading precarious lives in the informal or the gig economy in particular, so that they can actually isolate when they need to, they can get help when they need to. So I think those three elements of the political leadership, of the infrastructure in place, which goes from health to social care to education to much else, and the social stability, the social security in its broadest sense are the key things, as well as the technical capacity.
Thank you very much, Professor McKee. I have a question from Camille from AFP. Thank you very much for joining us again, Camille. The regional director told us earlier that the pandemic would be behind us when 70% of the world's population was vaccinated. Are you still aiming for that ratio, or would it need to be higher? Regional director.
Thank you, Camille. True that a while ago, the European Technical Advisory Group was recommending about 80% of the eligible population, but this was at a time that there was no such emergence of more transmissible and virulent variants of concern. So I think it brings us to the point that the aim of a vaccination is first and foremost to prevent more serious disease and deaths, mortality, and at the same time to unload the pressure from our healthcare systems, who desperately have to pick up with other diseases than COVID-19. So priority is definitely to increase the vaccination, but do it all, as was told. We need to keep a pressure on the virus, and we need to have a comprehensive strategy to increase vaccine uptake, sharing, and production. But I would say at the same time, if we consider that SARS-CoV-2 will continue to mutate and remain with us the way influenza is, then we should anticipate how to gradually adapt our vaccination strategy to endemic transmission and gather really precious knowledge about the impact of additional jabs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Regional Director. I'm going to squeeze one more question in. I appreciate we're at the top of the hour. From Reuters, sent in. This one is for Siddhartha Datta. If you could answer briefly, please, Siddhartha. What is the status of the Sputnik vaccine in the emergency use listing?
Thank you, Rob. Thank you so much for that question. Just to let you know that the decision on approval of the emergency use listing of any vaccine is done based on the evaluation of the data that are submitted from the vaccine applicants as they come in. And for the Sputnik V vaccine, we are currently waiting for the complete submission of all the documents by the applicants and the manufacturer of the Sputnik V from Gamaleya following our inspections. The report of the inspection is already available at the public site. So once this information are made available, when we confirm the safety, quality, and the efficacy of the vaccine based on the good manufacturing practices and on the evaluation of the good clinical practices that were done earlier, WHO will be able to share the possible outcome of that evaluation from the independent technical advisory group. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Siddhartha. It only remains for me now to pass the floor to the Regional Director to make some closing remarks.
Thank you, Rob. My closing remarks is a very sincere appreciation to the Chair of the Pan-European Commission, Professor Mario Monti, who has invested personally a lot in this Pan-European Commission. I mean, it's so timely that we have a new strategy on health and sustainable development towards 2030 within the context of the Sustainable Development Goals to be presented to the 53 member states at the Region Committee, which starts Monday, 9 a.m. Central European Time. It can be followed publicly. The link is on our website. My appreciation to President Tarja Halonen and Professor Martin McKee, representing also all the commissioners and for their tremendous contribution to our experts, Siddhartha, Katie, and Rob. Thank you so much for joining us. Stay healthy, stay connected, and hope to see you on Monday virtually. Thank you. Goodbye.